We have a question that goes to America's reach around the world. Now let's bring in Alexander McCoy. He's a former Marine Corps sergeant. He's from Rhode Island, and he served in Saudi Arabia, Germany, and Honduras. He's now a student at Columbia University. He says he's leaning towards supporting Secretary Clinton. Interestingly, for you, Alexander, Mr. Barack, I believe, is the only person who served active duty in the armed forces in the race right now. So what's your question, sir?
Dr. Stein, you said that you oppose the use of U.S. forces overseas. U.S. forces are currently engaged in airstrikes against ISIS and other military operations. My question is, do you consider ISIS to be a threat to the U.S. or to U.S. allies and partners in the Middle East? And if so, what would you do to defeat ISIS that the Obama administration is not currently doing?
So, you know, there are rules of engagement, international rules, that if you're going to attack another country, you need to be at imminent threat of being actually attacked by them. Clearly, that threshold has not been met. ISIS is not about to launch a major attack against our country. And we have a track record now of fighting terrorism, not only ISIS, but Al-Qaeda before it, the Taliban before that. And this track record is not looking so good. We have spent $6 trillion, according to a recent Harvard study, when you include the costs, the ongoing costs of health care for our wounded veterans who deserve the highest care possible. $6 trillion, which since 2001. We have killed 1 million people in Iraq alone, which is not winning us the hearts and minds in the Middle East. We have lost tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers that have been killed or severely wounded. And what do we have to show for this? Failed states, mass refugee migrations, and repeated terrorist threats that get worse with each cycle. So ISIS grew out of the catastrophe of Iraq. Al-Qaeda, in turn, grew out of Afghanistan. And in fact, in Afghanistan, it was the CIA and the Saudis together who created the first so-called jihadi movement with the Mujahideen in order to make trouble against the Soviet Union. So this has been a very ill-conceived plan that has been backfiring madly against us. So what we say is that we need a new kind of offensive in the Middle East, because bombing terrorism and shooting terrorism is not quelling terrorism. It's only fanning the flames of terrorism, the misery and the poverty that drive terrorism. We are calling for a new kind of offensive, a peace offensive in the Middle East that begins with a weapons embargo. And since we are supplying, the U.S. is supplying the majority of the weapons to actually all combatants, we and our allies are arming most of the fighting forces in the Middle East, we can initiate that weapons embargo. And we also call for a freeze on the funding of those countries who continue to support jihadi terrorist enterprises. Hillary Clinton herself said in a leaked State Department memo that in fact the Saudis are still the major funder of terrorist Sunni enterprises. So if we started it, we and our allies have the capacity to shut it down. So that's how we need to move forward.
So, Doctor, just to be clear, you said you call for a military spending cut of 50%. You want all foreign bases closed. There's no question that this is a complex problem. It's not just a military solution, but the military is almost always involved in different reckonings of a solution. Are you saying that there'd be no U.S. military presence anywhere else in the world and that would keep America safe?
So we now have somewhere between 700 or 800 or even more military bases around the world. Do you know how many military bases all other countries combined have? About 30. There's something really wrong with this picture. Do you know? Do you know how much of our budget actually goes to maintaining this bloated and dangerous military budget? 54% of our discretionary
So you
budget,
would close
which
all
is
of them?
about half of your income tax, is going to this failed, catastrophic policy of regime change.
But I'm just trying to be clear. Would you close all of them?
That would be our presumption. There may be certain bases for certain circumstances that need to remain open, but our presumption is to close the bases, and our presumption is also to shut down the weapon systems like the F-35 that will cost us almost $1.5 trillion before we're done, or to shut down the new generation of nuclear weapons, which has no role whatsoever in military or on the planet. We need to be backing off and phasing out all nuclear weapons now, not moving forward with a new $1 trillion program for new nuclear weapons.
Mr. Baraka?
You know, Chris, there's an assumption in your question that we have to take a look at, and that is that that we're going to be able to respond in a military fashion to all of these various threats. See, one of the reasons why we have the ISIS threat today is because of the enormous incompetency of U.S. policy in the so-called Middle East over the last 16 years. Mm-hmm. You can't, talk about the ISIS threat and then not look at the kinds of policies that help to facilitate the growth of ISIS. You can't talk about your concern about the possibility of imminent attacks in the U.S. and support policies that created a territory in Syria where people were able to train, equip themselves, and be prepared to launch attacks all over the world. So I would invite the American people to look critically at the policies pursued by both the Bush and the Obama administrations. They helped to create the problem that we now have. Look, the security issue is real. There's no question about that. Okay, and people are concerned about that, and we understand that. But this sort of knee-jerk response in terms of military action, we've got to be very, very critical of that. And because this notion of militarism has been sold to the American population, and people, just think that the first reaction is a military one, when what we're looking at is a political and an ideological challenge also that the U.S. foreign policy has played right into.